Oh, thank you so much, Catherine, for joining me today. It's a huge pleasure to be able to have you here and just discuss this deeply important topic that affects so many people. And I think a lot of people are almost afraid to talk about it, which is perfectionism.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here.
Thank you. So, I'm going to do a brief introduction and go straight into the questions because this book is very important. So, Katherine Morgan Schafler is a psychotherapist, writer, and speaker, and former on site therapist at Google. She earned degrees and trained at UC Berkeley and Columbia University with postgraduate certification from the Association for Spirituality and Psychotherapy in NYC. The Perfectionist's Guide to Losing Control: A Path to Peace and Power is her first book. So of course I've got to ask, which is, what is your personal experience with perfectionism? Although obviously you do mention bits in the book, so I just wanted to let you share.
Yes. So I am a perfectionist. I didn't always think of myself as a perfectionist, but in doing so much work with perfectionists and then taking a step back and looking at my career from 30,000 feet in the air, I saw that perfectionism was actually in so many different clinical contexts. And that the dynamics of it were in me. And so that really spurred so much curiosity in me about what is perfectionism and what makes someone a perfectionist. And I looked to academia and the research and wasn't fully satisfied with what I found. We all agree that the research on perfectionism is in its infancy, and so there's not a lot of language
Mm.
describing the kaleidoscopic, multidimensional force that perfectionism is. And that was so frustrating to me. So I thought, well, why don't I try my hand at naming some of these patterns that I'm seeing in my clients across all these different kinds of contexts and putting language markers to what I know about perfectionism. So I wrote The Perfectionist Guide to Losing Control to really start this conversation that I want everyone to continue having and that I don't think has an ending.
That's so true. It's a big conversation, and I had no idea there's so many sort of tenets to it as well. There's not just like a straight version of perfectionism for everyone. But you do talk about like it's seen as such a negative, isn't it, perfectionism? So why do you think it's actually seen in such a sort of negative light generally?
Yes, you're right. So the mainstream approach to perfectionism right now is to tell perfectionists some version of just don't be so much of a perfectionist. And the subtext of that directive is just be less of who you are. And that doesn't work. It doesn't work for a lot of reasons, but mostly because perfectionism is a natural, innate human impulse.
Mm.
And I think it's present in everybody. People who are perfectionists experience that impulse more often than not and in a patterned way.
Mm.
So the difference between someone who's a perfectionist and someone who's not is just degree and frequency, really, of this universal impulse we all feel, which is the way I describe perfectionism. It's noticing the difference, the gap between the reality and some kind of different version of reality, a reality in which is perhaps improved or better. It's a unique cognitive capacity of our species that we can perceive what's happening around us, but also imagine things in a worse off way and imagine things in a better way. And perfectionists are people who notice that gap between the reality and the ideal and who feel this real compulsion and real active quality to try and bridge the gap. And
Mm.
perfectionism can be healthy and it can be unhealthy. And healthy perfectionists understand that the ideal is not meant to be achieved, it's meant to inspire.
Hmm.
And unhealthy perfectionists can sometimes lose sight of that.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I can definitely attest to that for sure. And I think one of the big, I think, aspects of sort of unhealthy perfectionism is punishing yourself, which is, and I was just wondering, how do perfectionists stop punishing themselves?
Yeah, so perfectionists stop punishing themselves by understanding one, that punishment doesn't work, and two, by understanding that self compassion is actually the thing that's going to help them do all the things that they're trying to get punishment to help them do. So let me back up here. My definition of a punishment is doing anything to create more pain for yourself,
Mm,
um, in order to motivate you to change, right? And that's all punishment does, is it lays pain on whatever's already there. And we choose punishment because we don't understand that it doesn't work. And not only does it not work, that it makes everything worse, we also don't understand that we have other choices. And so punishment is really different than discipline. It's different than taking personal accountability. It's different than allowing natural consequences to unfold. It's different than rehabilitation. All those last four things I just mentioned require a degree of thoughtfulness and
mm,
intention and taking reparative measures. And there's a proactive quality to a lot of those things. Punishment is just reactive.
mm.
And punishment just seeks to create pain. Punishment is lazy. And so a punishment is when you purposefully deny yourself something that you know is going to help you, or you purposefully do something that you know is going to hurt you. With the
Mm.
grand plan of, like, I'm going to make myself hurt so that I can get better. And we don't heal by hurting ourselves.
Yeah, it's a vicious cycle, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. And we were talking about, the different kinds of perfectionism, which is, I think you mentioned those five types. Was it messy, intense, classic, Parisian, which I thought was really interesting, and procrastinator, just because my partner's Parisian, so I thought that was quite funny.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Apologies. I will just ignore that. So, how do you think sort of having the identification of all of these actually helps with it?
Language really helps me. It helps me to graft what I'm thinking, feeling, experiencing onto words, and just creating space for my experience to bounce back and be able to gauge, oh, is this what I'm feeling, or is it that? And there's power in language. Language can really help contain some of our experiences and validate them back to us. So I offer the five different types of perfectionists because all the language around perfectionism is about how it's bad and unhealthy. And for women in particular, we need to stop being perfectionistic and be more balanced. And there's a lot of, again, encouragement to eradicate this thing, which requires a lot of energy and doesn't work because research confirms this. Perfectionists experience their perfectionism as an enduring identity marker, in the same way that someone might think of themselves as an artist or a
Mm,
romantic or an activist. That's how people think of themselves when they think of themselves as a perfectionist.
mm,
And so, in the same way that I wouldn't tell someone who's a romantic, listen, just take your belief in love and knock it down 30%, and you're going to be good. That's not how you approach that. You say, there's nothing wrong with being a romantic. I love it. I love a romantic. I'm a romantic myself. This is amazing. This is wonderful. Enjoy it. Also, you need boundaries around this,
mm,
or it's going to get really unhealthy. And so that's what I tried to do with perfectionism, is just to say, what a beautiful quality. I love working with perfectionists. I love this like ceaseless drive. I love the force and power and undercurrent behind this construct that is really propelling so much forward motion and energy. And also, we need boundaries around this. Otherwise,
Yeah.
it's going to get out of hand. And so I can get into the 5 types of perfectionists if you like, each of which has its own pros and cons, just like perfectionism as a general construct does.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned this just before, which is how women in particular have this very negative aspect of, or criticized for being perfectionists, or even expected to be perfectionists. So, do you think perfectionism is gendered?
I know perfectionism is gendered. It's very gendered. And I talk about a lot of the ways it's gendered within the book.
Mm.
You know, you can't be a perfectionist without being ambitious. And when you broadcast your ambition as a woman in the world, unless your ambition is directed towards typical feminine, sort of domestic, archetypal homemaker interests, you will be punished for broadcasting that ambition. So women are constantly walking this tightrope of trying to stake claim to what they want and their power
Mm.
while also remaining palatable and basically, you know, not being too bitchy or too direct or too this or too that. And a lot of the ways in which the word perfectionist is used right now um, carries that subtext of you're doing too much,
Mhm.
you're being too much. Calm down, find balance, be less, do less. It's you're not being healthy. Balanced people are healthy. You're not being balanced. And these directives are all directed towards women for the most part. Men aren't receiving this message. And
Mm.
if we look at celebrated um, women perfectionists like Martha Stewart or Marie Kondo, we're seeing suddenly perfectionism is okay if it's for brunch recipes in a pinch, and perfectionism is okay if it's for tidying up and paint palettes that pop, and we celebrate it and syndicate it. But when you look at female perfectionists like Serena Williams or Anna
Mm.
Wintour or these other people who, you know, maybe aren't always palatable or like warm maternal leaders, or maybe who don't apologize for their skill and their desire to win, maybe when they're very clear about their level of competitiveness,
Mm.
there's immediate backlash to that.
Yeah.
And when you contrast that with male men who are considered perfectionists, like Gordon Ramsay's public persona, or Steve Jobs, or you know James Cameron, it's sort of like that kind of perfectionism isn't pathologized in the same way.
Mm.
Those are high standards. Those are men. Those are visionary men. Those
Mm.
are men who, you know, are on the frontier. And so it's really, you know, a very different paradigm for men and women negotiating the mechanics of ambition in the world. And in the same way that bossy as a word was used to regulate authoritative, um, power seeking in girls and women, and we don't often call young boys sassy or bossy or you know
Feisty.
feisty. We are using the word perfectionist to regulate power seeking and authoritative qualities in women. And I talk about a lot of the language markers around this and why it's not an accident that you never hear men describe themselves as recovering perfectionists, because
Mm.
they're not taught to recover from their perfectionism. And you do not, there's no word for resting jerk face like there is resting bitch face,
Oh
right?
yeah.
Because men are not expected to constantly be smiling and pleasing and palatable all the time. And when you say strong minded, she's a strong minded woman, that gains a superlative quality when you describe men that way, because men are expected to be strong-minded. And
Mm,
so it wouldn't make sense to say strong-minded man. And all these language catches and markers are really powerful ways that a culture pushes forward implicitly their agenda, which is, in this case, a misogynistic agenda, right? To
mm.
keep women in their place, which is below men.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Mary Kondo because there was a huge sort of outpouring after she revealed she'd stopped cleaning the way she used to, and it was so strange because it was like she's a mum and she's just got no time. Of course, she doesn't have time to do that, and it was amazing just to see the response was bizarre. I was like,
Mhm.
okay, so how do we differentiate or even is perfectionism and ambition the same thing?
No, because you can be ambitious without being a perfectionist, though you can't be a perfectionist without being ambitious.
Mm,
And the difference between someone who is a high striver and a perfectionist is that high strivers can stop striving at some
mm,
point, and they can be good with that. Perfectionists can't do that. So, for example, a high striver who's had a really um, amazing career, let's say, can retire super young, 55. Say, you know what, I'm going to call it. This was great fun. I have so much money now and so many resources and such great relationships, and I'm just going to retire and go chill on a beach somewhere and just kind of plan on doing nothing. That is horrifying to a perfectionist, right? Nightmare. And perfectionists, when they achieve a goal, always create another goal, a
mm,
bigger goal, because their objective is not to achieve goals. It is to chase the ideal that the goal represents. So their
mm,
work is never done, and they like it that way. And I like that. And healthy perfectionists take great joy in finding an ideal that is worthy of a lifetime of striving, that they
mm,
know they're never going to finish. It doesn't matter to them. That's not the point.
mm. That's yeah. Okay, that is good to know because sometimes you do wonder. It's like, okay, where am I in this sort of spectrum, essentially? And actually, I think you do mention trusting yourself in this
Mhm.
process. So why is it important to trust yourself whilst you're sort of figuring it out, essentially?
Yeah, so the last chapter of the book is really dedicated to rebuilding trust with yourself. And I think that's such a critical part of mental wellness and mental health. And the reason for that is, this is a book about creating self defined success. Because if you don't understand what your values are and what's important to you, then you're going to default to the culture's values. And the cultural values aren't automatically bad, but it's not likely that they will be magically aligned with your own. And
Mm,
culture, at least in the United States, cultural values are really about quantitative goals and efficiency. So bigger, better, faster, more. And that might not be what actually brings you a sense of purpose, meaning, fullness, joy, connection, which are all the things that bring you
mm,
mental wellness. The number one marker and predictor of mental health is your relational wealth. It's how much you feel in connection to yourself, to others, to your community. It's not bigger, better, faster, more. And so while bigger, better, faster, more may work for some people to create a sense of fulfillment, it doesn't work for most people, is what I have experienced in my work. And so to answer your question, to understand, well, if the cultural default value system doesn't work for me, what does? Only you know that. And you have to be able to plug in to your internal system so that you can understand what brings you pleasure and so that you can honor it
Mm.
and gain a sense of fulfillment. And the only way to do that is if you trust yourself to allow yourself to experience pleasure. And I want to make a distinction between pleasure and immediate gratification here.
Mm.
And the difference is that if we break up an experience into three parts, we have the actual experience itself, the event. Let's say I'm talking about going for a walk. Going for a walk is the event. Then there's the anticipation of the experience and the recall of the experience. So the anticipation, when you're engaged in something that actually brings you pleasure,
Mm.
is positive. You're like, oh, I can't wait to go for a walk later. And then the event itself is positive. And then the recalling of the event is also positive. You enjoy each three of those parts. Whereas with immediate gratification, the event looks and sounds and feels and tastes like pleasure, but the anticipation might be tinged with a sense of, oh, I hope I don't give in, right? And the recall might be something like, oh, I can't believe I did that again. I meant to stop doing that. I meant to not, indulge so much in some way. And there's some anxiety around that. And so what I see is people working so hard to achieve their goals or be some version of themselves that they think they're supposed to be, that they deny themselves pleasure in the name of responsibility and self-discipline. When actually denying yourself true pleasure is putting you at real risk for depression,
Mm.
one, but also just for, a sense of not being connected to yourself. Pleasure informs. And being able to stay attuned and awake to what makes you feel good in
Mm.
this most basic way, that shows you what your values are. And without that barometer, it's just a lot of guesswork and spinning the wheel.
Yeah, that's so true. Gosh. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, definitely. Oh God, it was great. It was it was such a great read, honestly, because it just reassured me, honestly, because I think it's one of those things that we just sort of flagellate ourselves with for so long when you don't have a response or an answer that is positive towards perfectionism. So yes, it's good to hear the other side. So thank you so much, Catherine.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I looked forward to this podcast. I enjoyed talking with you. And when
You
we get
too.
off the phone,
You too.
the cast, I will enjoy thinking about it. This was a true pleasure.